Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never used to check my husband's credit card statements. I trusted him. He was always the one who managed our finances, reminding me how careful he was with money. But that day, I don't even know why. I just had a feeling. I opened the online banking app and clicked on his account. At first, it seemed normal. Groceries, gas, a few online purchases. But then, my heart stopped. There were multiple hotel charges. Fancy hotels. And they weren't from trips we took together. My hands shook as I scrolled through the past months. The charges were frequent, always at night, always the same few hotels. My mind raced. Who was he taking there? That night, I waited for him to come home, my heart pounding. I told myself to stay calm, to ask casually. When he walked in, I smiled, pretending everything was normal. Hey, babe, I was looking at the bank statement today. Weird question, have you been staying at hotels? His face changed instantly. A flicker of something, guilt? Panic? He forced a laugh. Oh, those. Work trips. Last-minute meetings. But he was lying. I knew it. His job didn't require travel. My stomach churned. Was this really happening? I didn't push him that night. Instead, I played along. I nodded, smiled, and pretended to believe him. But inside, I was breaking. I stayed up late, going through the statements again. That's when I noticed the pattern. The hotel stays were always on the same days each month. Like clockwork. And there was more, restaurant charges at expensive places, boutiques, even a jewelry store. My mind was spinning. Who was he spending on? A mistress? A secret life? I needed proof. The next day, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I snooped. I knew his routines, so when he was in the shower, I grabbed his phone. But the moment I touched it, the screen lit up, and I saw it. A second phone, lying next to it. My breath caught. I never noticed it before. My hands trembled as I picked it up, but it was locked. Of course it was. I put it back before he could suspect anything, but my mind was racing. A second phone? A hidden life? I needed to know more. I couldn't just ask him about the phone. I needed more than suspicions. So, I made a plan. I would track his movements, find out where he was going. I remembered an old GPS tracker I once bought for my car. That night, when he was asleep, I slipped outside and attached it under his. My hands were shaking the whole time. This wasn't me. I wasn't the type to spy on my husband. But I had to know the truth. And something told me I wouldn't like what I found. The next morning, I woke up with my heart racing. My phone buzzed, a notification from the tracker. He had already left for work, or so I thought. But the tracker told a different story. His car wasn't anywhere near his office. It was across town, parked outside a cafe. My stomach twisted. Who was he meeting? My hands shook as I refreshed the app over and over, watching the little dot on the map. He stayed there for an hour. Then, he drove, straight to one of the hotels from the credit card statement. I couldn't just sit at home and wonder. I needed to see for myself. So, I threw on a hoodie, sunglasses, and grabbed my keys. My heart pounded as I drove to the hotel, parking across the street. His car was already there. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I stared at the entrance, waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. And then, I saw him, walking out with someone. My breath caught. It was a woman. She was younger than me, dressed in designer clothes. And the way he looked at her, it wasn't business. It wasn't casual. It was intimate. I barely breathed as I watched them. They stood outside the hotel, talking, laughing. Then, he reached out, touched her arm. I felt sick. I wanted to storm over, scream, demand answers. But I didn't. I forced myself to stay put. I needed more than just a glimpse. I needed to know who she was. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. She walked to a sleek black car and drove off. I tailed her, heart hammering in my chest. I half expected her to go to a fancy apartment, maybe even another hotel. But no. She pulled into a quiet suburban street and parked in front of a house. A normal house. I watched as she got out, unlocked the front door, and went inside. Who was she? A mistress? A colleague? A stranger? I had to know. That night, when my husband came home, I acted normal. But inside, I was burning with questions. And I had a name now, Vanessa. The next morning, I sat at my laptop, determined. I typed Vanessa into social media, adding the city name. It took a while, but I found her. Her profile was public. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through her pictures. My husband was in some of them. Not in an obvious way, no romantic poses, no couple photos, but he was there. In the background of group dinners, in event pictures, standing close to her. They knew each other. For a long time. And then, I saw a post that made my blood run cold. A birthday post. "So grateful for the most important man in my life," she wrote. My husband's name wasn't tagged. But in the corner of the photo, I saw him. Smiling. Looking at her like she was his world. I stared at that post for what felt like hours. My husband, the most important man in her life? What did that mean? I scrolled further, heart racing. More photos, more events. And then, I saw it. A picture of her wearing a necklace, one I recognized instantly. I had seen the charge for it on the credit card bill. My husband had bought it for her. My stomach twisted. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just dinners and hotel rooms. He was giving her gifts. Meaningful ones. I needed answers. But confronting him again wouldn't work. He was too good at lying. No, I needed to catch him off guard. My opportunity came faster than I expected. That morning, he told me he had a late work dinner. My blood boiled, but I kept my face neutral. I nodded, kissed his cheek, and acted like the clueless wife he thought I was. The moment he left, I grabbed my keys. I knew exactly where he was going. And this time, I'd be there first. I arrived at the restaurant before them and found a discreet spot near the back. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. Minutes later, they walked in. My husband and Vanessa. She was laughing, touching his arm. And he looked at her like she was the center of his universe. My throat tightened. This was real. It wasn't some misunderstanding. And I was done watching from the sidelines. Before I could second-guess myself, I stood up and walked straight to their table. The second my husband saw me, his face drained of color. Vanessa looked confused at first, but then something flickered in her eyes. Recognition? I folded my arms and smiled sweetly. "Oh, don't stop on my account," I said. My husband stammered something about a business dinner, but Vanessa's expression shifted. "You didn't tell her?" she asked, voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. My pulse raced. "Tell me what?" My husband reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Go ahead," I said. "Tell me everything." Silence stretched between us. Vanessa glanced at my husband, then back at me. And then, she sighed. "I told you she'd find out eventually," she said, shaking her head. My breath caught. Find out what? My husband looked completely trapped, his face unreadable. And then Vanessa said the words that shattered my entire world. "I'm his fiancé." Fiancé? The word hit me like a freight train. I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. My husband's face was pale, his eyes darting between Vanessa and me. She looked at him with a smirk. "You didn't think I knew, did you?" she said. And for a moment, I couldn't tell if she was enjoying this or just tired of hiding. "We've been engaged for almost a year." My mind reeled. Almost a year? How had I not known? How could he have hidden this from me for so long? I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. "So, you've been living a double life?" I asked, my words slow, controlled. "How long, exactly, were you planning to keep this from me?" He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Vanessa didn't wait for him. "You don't know, do you?" she said, looking at me. "You were just the wife he hid behind. A cover." A cold wave washed over me, as if someone had poured ice water down my spine. "You don't get to talk about me like that," I shot back. "You had no right to do this to me." My husband finally spoke, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." I cut him off. "You didn't mean for it to happen? How many lies did you tell me then? How many years of my life did you waste, pretending everything was fine?" His face twisted in guilt, but there was nothing he could say that would fix this. Vanessa stood up, pulling my husband's hand into hers. "Maybe it's better this way," she said. "Now you know the truth." Her words hit me like a slap. They were both standing there, hand in hand, as if my entire world had no meaning. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned on my heel and walked out of the restaurant. My heart was breaking, but my steps were sure. I couldn't be in that place, surrounded by their lies and betrayal. I heard my husband call after me, but I didn't stop. I needed to leave, to breathe, to find some semblance of peace in the chaos he'd created. Outside, the cold air hit me, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire burning inside me. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything crash over me. I had been a fool. The days that followed were a blur. I didn't want to go home, didn't want to face him. So, I stayed at a friend's place for a few nights, barely sleeping, barely eating. But the phone calls came, then the texts. He begged for forgiveness, promised it had never been about me, that it was just a mistake. But I couldn't listen. Every word he said was another lie in a string of them. How could I ever trust him again? I couldn't. I needed to move on. But moving on felt impossible. I knew I couldn't stay. I kept telling myself that, over and over. But every time I thought about leaving, my chest tightened. This was my home. Our home. The one we built together. The one where we shared so many memories. But those memories felt tainted now. How could I stay in a house where every corner reminded me of his lies? The final straw came when he showed up at my friend's place, begging me to come home. His tears, his promises, they didn't move me anymore. I had to let go. When I finally agreed to meet him to discuss things, he looked so different. Gone was the man I thought I knew. In his place was a broken man, full of regret, but it was too late. I had made up my mind. I needed out. I needed to reclaim my life. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. I want a divorce. His face dropped, and I could see the shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected this, not really. But it was the only way for me to heal, and the only way for me to find peace again. The legal process was grueling. The lawyer I hired was professional, precise, and unemotional, but I wasn't. Every time we went over the details of the divorce, I could feel the anger bubbling up again. How could he have done this to me? To us? He was fighting for everything. Our house, our savings, even the things that didn't matter. I was more focused on getting my life back. The fights were endless. He wanted me to share everything, to give him another chance, but I couldn't. He had broken something in me that could never be fixed. It's strange, but even after everything, I still couldn't just let go. I was angry, hurt, betrayed, but there was a part of me that still missed the man I thought I knew. The man who had once made me laugh, the man who was supposed to be my partner. But I realized that man never really existed. It was a fantasy I had created in my mind. And that was the hardest part to let go of, my own illusions. Slowly, I started taking steps forward, working on myself, finding my footing again. It was hard, but it was necessary. It wasn't immediate. It took time. But little by little, I began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. I took up old hobbies, joined a gym, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. I started to enjoy my own company, something I had forgotten how to do. The more I focused on myself, the more I realized how strong I had become. I didn't need him to define me. I didn't need anyone to validate my worth. I was enough on my own. And that was the most powerful thing I had ever realized. It had been weeks since I'd last seen him. Life was moving on, and so was I. I was walking into a local coffee shop when I saw him. My heart skipped a beat. He looked the same, but somehow different. He wasn't the man I had married. There was an emptiness in his eyes. He spotted me almost immediately, his face full of guilt and regret. My first instinct was to turn and walk away, but instead, I froze. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then he spoke. "Can we talk?" We sat at a table, the silence between us thick with years of hurt. I could see him struggling to find the right words. "I've messed up," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I know. I've hurt you. I was selfish and blind, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The words were empty, though. They meant nothing to me now. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "Why did you do it? Why couldn't you just be honest with me?" His eyes welled up with tears. "I don't know," he whispered. "I thought I could have it all. I thought I could keep everything separate, but I was wrong." I could feel the anger rising in me again. But this time, I didn't let it control me. "You were never going to have it all," I said, my voice firm. "You couldn't have both me and her. And you didn't have the decency to be honest with me about it." He reached out, but I pulled away. I had to stand my ground. This conversation, this apology, it doesn't change anything. It's too late. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. This was it. I didn't need closure from him. I had already started closing the door on that chapter of my life. In the weeks that followed, I continued my healing process. I focused on the things that mattered most: my career, my friends, my family. I even started dating again, something I never thought I would be ready for. It wasn't easy, but I was stronger now. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also taught me something invaluable. My worth didn't come from my relationship with him. It came from within. I was enough on my own. And that was the most freeing realization of all. Life was looking up. I had a new sense of purpose, a renewed sense of self. My ex-husband still reached out from time to time, but I didn't need to respond anymore. I had moved on. I had found my strength, and I was starting fresh. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I knew that I was capable of facing anything life threw my way. And with each passing day, I grew more confident in the woman I had become. The truth had set me free, and now, the future was mine to shape. Thank you for listening to my story until now. If you like the video, please support it by subscribing and liking.